The fluorescent lights of St. Matthew's Medical Center hummed faintly overhead, filling the cardiology wing with a sterile brightness. Nurse Amara Johnson adjusted the cuff of her navy blue scrubs and glanced at the patient chart one last time before stepping into room 412. Inside, the room was unusually still. A middle-aged man sat upright in the bed, a folded newspaper resting on his lap. He had a thick head of silver hair, neatly brushed back, and wore the kind of expression that suggested he saw far more than he let on. His eyes, sharp, attentive but not unfriendly, flicked up from the paper when Amara entered. "Good morning, Mr. Davenport," she said, her tone warm but professional. "How are you feeling today?" The man offered a small smile. "Better than yesterday. That medication seems to be helping." His voice carried a calm authority, the kind that seemed naturally at ease with itself. Amara returned his smile, noting his blood pressure monitor and 4-line. Everything was stable. She adjusted the settings with efficient movements, her dark curls tucked neatly under her scrub cap. Years of nursing had taught her how to combine skill with compassion. Patients remembered both. She was about to ask a few follow-up questions when the door swung open. Dr. Richard Halloway entered the room like a storm cloud. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of entitlement that made the air feel thinner. His white coat swayed behind him, the embroidered name on the chest, R. Halloway MD, practically glowing under the fluorescent lights. "Johnson," he said, not bothering to look at her. "What's the status?" Amara's shoulders stiffened, but her voice remained even. "Mr. Davenport's vitals are stable. Blood pressure has come down since yesterday, heart rate is steady. No signs of—" "Did you actually record his intake properly this time?" Halloway interrupted, finally turning to face her. His pale blue eyes narrowed with a sneer. "Because the last thing I need is another sloppy charting error from you." Amara felt her cheeks heat, but she steadied herself. "Doctor, my charting has been accurate. The lab values are already in the system." Halloway cut her off again, shaking his head as though she were a child caught in a lie. "You people always have an excuse. Did you double-check the 4 dosage, or are we playing nurse roulette again?" The words hung heavy in the room. "You people." Amara's jaw tightened. She kept her gaze locked on the monitor, refusing to let him see the sting behind her composure. The patient, Mr. Davenport, hadn't moved. His sharp eyes followed every word, every flicker of tension, though his face remained unreadable. Amara forced herself to respond with clinical precision. "Yes, doctor. The 4 is set to 5 milliliters per hour, as ordered. I confirmed the dosage with pharmacy this morning." Halloway gave a mocking laugh, tilting his head toward Davenport. "You see, Mr. Davenport, this is what I have to deal with every day. Some people are promoted more for diversity quotas than for competence. You'd think after years of practice they'd learn the basics." Silence pooled in the corners of the room. Amara felt as though the walls had closed in on her. Every word was a blade, sharpened not just by arrogance but by the deliberate cruelty of saying it in front of a patient. Her hands stilled, clenched at her sides, but her voice remained calm. "With respect, doctor," she said softly, "that comment is unprofessional." Halloway smirked, as if amused that she dared to respond. "Don't get too sensitive, Nurse Johnson. This is medicine. Not everyone is cut out for the pressure. Not here. Not in front of him. Hold your ground." Mr. Davenport finally folded his newspaper, laying it neatly on the table beside him. His eyes, calm, steady, and strangely commanding, lingered first on Amara, then shifted slowly to the doctor. But he said nothing. Not yet. Amara excused herself soon after, her hands trembling slightly as she left the room. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, the usual perfume of the hospital, but today it felt sharper, almost suffocating. She walked quickly toward the break room, needing a moment to breathe. Inside, 2 other nurses sat at the small round table, sipping lukewarm coffee. They looked up as she entered, their faces immediately softening with concern. "Amara," whispered Jenny, a fellow RN with sandy hair pulled into a messy bun. "We heard. He did it again, didn't he?" "In front of a patient this time," Amara said quietly. "He said," the rest caught in her throat. The weight of those 2 words, "you people," felt heavier than a lead apron. Jenny swore under her breath. "He thinks he's untouchable." "He is," muttered Carlos, another nurse, shaking his head. "You know how this place works. Doctors like him walk on water. Nurses sink." Amara sat down, resting her head in her hands for a moment. She had been in nursing nearly 12 years and she loved her work, the rhythm of the ward, the privilege of being at someone's bedside during their most vulnerable moments. but the humiliations chipped away at her little by little. "I can't keep letting him get away with it," she said softly, not sure if she meant to be heard. Jenny squeezed her hand. "You're one of the best nurses on this floor. Everyone knows it. Don't let him convince you otherwise." Her pager beeped, cutting the moment short. She rose, adjusted her scrub top, and forced herself back into the corridors. Patients needed her. And she refused to let one man's arrogance rob her of her purpose. Meanwhile, in room 412, Charles Davenport leaned back against his pillows, his gaze still fixed on the closed door. His expression, which had seemed mild and patient before, hardened slightly. He picked up his phone from the bedside table and tapped out a brief note before setting it aside again. His lips pressed together, as though the decision he had just made was quiet but firm. By the next morning, Amara returned to room 412 to check on her patient. She had slept poorly, tossing and turning with the words replaying in her mind. Yet as always she walked in with a steady smile. Davenport greeted her warmly, asking about her night, and Amara was struck again by how observant he seemed, as though he could see every flicker of doubt behind her eyes. She brushed it off and continued her work. A few hours later, a call went out over the internal line. The hospital director was requesting a private meeting with Dr. Holloway. Such summons were rare, and word spread quickly through the staff like an electric current. Holloway, as usual, strutted toward the administrative wing, annoyance etched on his face. He hated being interrupted. When he entered the director's office, however, he froze. Sitting comfortably in a leather chair opposite the director was none other than Charles Davenport, dressed in a sharp gray suit, his posture erect, his expression commanding. Gone was the gown and the four. He looked every inch the man of influence he was. "Mr. Davenport," Holloway stammered. "I didn't expect." "No," Davenport said evenly, his deep voice carrying a weight that made the air heavier. "I don't imagine you did." The director gestured for Holloway to sit. "Doctor, Mr. Davenport has brought a matter of grave concern to my attention." "If this is about yesterday," Holloway said with a thin smile, "I assure you my comments were simply misinterpreted." "I assure you, doctor, they were not," Davenport replied. "I have presided over hundreds of trials, listened to liars and men who believed their power let them demean others. I recognize arrogance when I see it. And I recognize discrimination." Holloway's mouth opened, then closed again. Davenport's voice remained low but unyielding. "You humiliated a skilled professional in front of me, demeaned her competence and reduced her identity to a stereotype. That is not only unprofessional, it is dangerous. Patients' lives depend on respect and teamwork. You showed neither." The director leaned forward. "Dr. Holloway, effective immediately, you are suspended pending review. There will be a formal investigation into your conduct. Until that time, you will not step foot into any patient's room." "What?" Holloway shot up. "You can't. My record, my reputation." "Your reputation is precisely what we are protecting," Davenport said. "Because if this matter were to leave these walls, you would not only lose that reputation, you might lose your license as well." Holloway glared, but the usual smugness drained from his face. He muttered something and stormed out. The door shut behind him with a sharp click. The director let out a slow breath and turned to Davenport. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. We should have acted sooner. His behavior has been noted before, but never with such clarity." "Then perhaps now you'll begin to listen," Davenport said. "Protect professionals like Nurse Johnson. She is the kind of nurse who reminds patients why they still trust medicine. If she walks away because she feels unsupported, you'll have lost someone far more valuable than Dr. Holloway." That afternoon, Amara received a message from the nurse supervisor. She was requested in the director's office. Her stomach sank. Rarely was a nurse summoned upstairs for praise. She walked down the quiet corridor, her palms sweating despite her composure. Inside, the director greeted her with unusual warmth. "Nurse Johnson, thank you for coming." Before he could say more, the door opened again. Charles Davenport entered, not in a hospital gown but in the same gray suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his presence suddenly commanding. "Mr. Davenport?" Amara asked, startled. He smiled faintly. "Yes, Nurse Johnson. Forgive the surprise. I thought it better to reveal myself here." "Reveal yourself?" The director cleared his throat. "Mr. Davenport is a member of our hospital board. He has brought to my attention what occurred yesterday." Amara felt her breath catch. Heat rose to her cheeks. She dropped her gaze to her hands. "I'm sorry, sir. I should not have." "Do not apologize," Davenport said firmly, his voice cutting through her words like a lifeline. You held yourself with dignity in the face of humiliation. You did nothing wrong. The failure was his, not yours. The hospital will be conducting a formal review, the director added. Dr. Holloway has been suspended. Amara sat frozen, trying to absorb it. For years he had walked these halls untouchable. Now he had been called to account. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say nothing, Davenport replied softly. Simply keep doing what you do. Because it matters. When she left the office, her steps felt lighter. For once, the weight of silence had shifted. In the corridor, she passed other nurses who looked at her curiously, sensing something had changed though they didn't yet know what. Amara only offered a small, steady smile. That evening, as she walked out beneath a fading orange sky, she spotted Davenport near the entrance. He was speaking with another board member, but when his eyes met hers, he gave the smallest nod. Not grand. Not theatrical. Enough. News traveled fast. By the next morning, whispers floated through corridors like drifting smoke. Dr. Holloway had been suspended. Nurses exchanged quick glances, half in disbelief, half in relief. Residents who had worked under his withering criticism walked with a cautious sense of vindication. For years, his arrogance had seemed permanent. Now it had cracked. Amara went about her duties with her usual professionalism, but the glances followed her. A few colleagues offered quiet smiles when no one else was watching. Others, especially younger nurses, seemed emboldened just by the knowledge that something had happened. Still, the memory lingered. Words like his didn't dissolve because a punishment arrived. They left bruises that outlasted the moment. She wondered if patients who had overheard him in the past thought less of her because of what he had said. During a quiet moment, she stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered in pale light, but her reflection looked tired. She thought of all the nurses who had endured and walked away in silence. Some had quit. Some had learned to bury their anger. She had nearly been one of them. Then she remembered Davenport's voice. You did nothing wrong. That strength deserves acknowledgement. The echo felt less like a wound and more like a shield. Perhaps this time something had changed. A few days later, she was asked to attend a staff meeting. The conference room was larger than usual, the long oval table surrounded by department heads, supervisors, and administrators. At the far end sat Davenport, once again in his tailored suit, his presence commanding without ostentation. Amara's heart pounded. The director began. We're here to address an issue that affects the culture of this hospital. Professionalism, respect, and equity are foundational to care. Mr. Davenport has agreed to assist us in reviewing policies and practices to ensure all staff, regardless of role or background, are treated with respect. I requested Nurse Johnson be present, Davenport said, meeting her eyes, because no discussion about respect can occur without the voices of those most affected. She stood with dignity in the face of humiliation. That dignity should guide us. Amara felt every gaze on her, not judgment but recognition. She swallowed and spoke, her voice steady despite the tremor inside. All I want is to do my job without being made to feel less than what I am. Nurses are here to serve patients, to ease suffering, to uphold the same values as every doctor in this building. We can't give patients the care they deserve if we're constantly being torn down. Her words settled on the room. A resident nodded, grateful someone had finally said it. Davenport's eyes glimmered with quiet approval. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway's world began to collapse. At home, he paced the floors of his immaculate suburban house. His wife listened in silence, accustomed to his tirades, though this time fear edged his anger. Suspension meant risk. Risk meant reputation. And his reputation was his only currency. He made calls, tried to rally allies, but doors that once opened closed with polite excuses. Davenport's influence was heavier than he'd imagined. Old whispers resurfaced. Nurses filed complaints they'd once been too afraid to sign. The investigation widened. His arrogance, once a shield, became liability. Back at the hospital, Amara's days slowly lightened. Patients greeted her with warmth, colleagues with quiet respect. One afternoon, adjusting an elderly woman's the patient smiled. You're the one who stood up to that doctor, aren't you? Who told you that? Amara asked, startled. Word gets around, the woman chuckled. Good for you, dear. Not many people have the courage. Courage, Amara thought. It hadn't felt like courage. It had felt like survival. Weeks passed. The inquiry concluded. Holloway's suspension would be extended indefinitely, pending the revocation of his privileges. The language was careful, legalistic but clear. His reign of intimidation was over. On the day of the announcement, Amara left at dusk. The sky wore streaks of violet and gold. Near the entrance, Davenport stood alone, leaning on a cane, radiating quiet authority. "I don't know how to thank you," she told him. "There's no need," he said. "Silence is complicity. I've lived too long to let men believe they can say whatever they wish without consequence." "Why me?" she asked. "Why speak up now?" "Because you reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten," Davenport said. "Dignity, even under fire, is the most powerful thing a person can hold. You showed it. It deserved defense." He walked toward a waiting car, leaving Amara under the fading light, the hum of the city rising. She thought of all the days she had endured quietly. She thought of countless nurses who had walked away in silence. But tonight, she believed silence had been broken. Tomorrow would be another long day. But different. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because now she knew change was possible. Change arrived in small ways first. A laminated card appeared on every workstation listing a code of mutual respect, not as a poster to ignore but as a policy with teeth. Attending physicians and nurses were required to attend the same high-reliability communication training, where everyone practiced closed-loop communication and debriefs. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened and responded to quickly. In morning rounds, the tradition of the physician presenting alone shifted. The nurse at the bedside opened with the overnight changes and the resident followed. It was subtle, but every time Amara spoke first, she felt the entire weight of teamwork shift a degree closer to balance. One Friday near the end of the month, the cardiac step-down unit jolted to life with a triple page, rapid response. Room 417. Then a code blue. Amara ran with the crash cart, her sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Inside 417, a man in his 50s lay cyanotic, an empty pill bottle on the floor. A young resident hovered near the foot of the bed, eyes wide. "Airway first," Amara said, already at the head of the bed. "Bag valve mask. 2-hand seal. You," she pointed to the resident, "start compressions. Hard and fast. Count out loud." The resident blinked. I thought." "No time," Amara said. "Switch every 2 minutes. Carlos, get me 1 milligram epinephrine. Draw 2 amps bicarb. Pads on. Charging to 200. She squeezed the bag in rhythm with the chest compressions, watching the monitor. Flatline became coarse V-fib. "Clear," she called. The defibrillator clicked and discharged. The patient's body jolted. Compressions resumed. 2 minutes later, a rhythm flickered. Pulse returned, weak but present. The resident's hands shook. Thank you, Nurse Johnson." "Team effort," Amara said, but she saw the way the others looked at her, how the charge nurse, the RT, even the security officer at the door, had rallied to her comm center. The patient stabilized and was transferred to ICU. Hours later, the attending physician came down the hall to find her. "I watched the code review," he said simply. "You ran it like a pro." She felt the awkward warmth of honest praise. "We all did. Somebody has to be the voice in the storm," he said. "You were." Word of the code spread, not as gossip but as a kind of ballast. An example others could attach to when fear and hierarchy muddled decisiveness. Amara found she was sleeping better. Her mother called and said, "Your voice always was your strength, baby. Even when you were quiet." "Maybe I'm learning how to use it," Amara said, laughing softly. "Or maybe I finally believe it matters." Another meeting convened, smaller, more practical. The director, the chief nursing officer, and attending from cardiology, 2 residents, and Amara. Davenport attended via video from his home. He'd been discharged weeks earlier, his recovery steady. "We can write policies forever," Davenport said on the screen, "but culture is behavior repeated. What habits do we want to hardwire?" The group built a simple set of rituals: a weekly interdisciplinary huddle, a standing invitation for nurses to present at morbidity and mortality conferences, and a speak-up drill at the start of each shift where one person, rotating, practiced interrupting a senior colleague respectfully. It felt awkward at first. Then it felt normal. Still, the investigation's final act loomed. The Medical Executive Committee scheduled a closed hearing to consider permanent revocation of Holloway's privileges. Subpoenaed emails and nurse notes were reviewed. 3 residents, 2 nurses, and an ultrasound tech provided testimony. The ultrasound tech, a quiet man in his 40s, described the week Holloway had berated him for bringing the wrong probe, though he had brought the correct one. A resident recounted being told that nurses need to know their place. The words sat in the hearing room like smoke that wouldn't clear. Holloway arrived with a lawyer and a jaw set to break stone. He insisted he'd been misunderstood, that his demand for excellence had been twisted into slander. He tried to talk about outcomes, about how many lives he had saved. The committee listened, impassive. When it was Amara's turn, she did not speak of dignity or the weight of words in broad terms. She spoke of the moment a patient hears a remark and wonders who on the team can be trusted. She spoke of a new grad nurse who cried in the supply closet because a physician had mocked her in front of a family. She recounted how, during Holloway's comment in room 412, she watched the patient's eyes shift from the monitor to her face and knew that trust had been put on a scale and found wanting. "I don't want him punished because I dislike him," she said, her voice calm. "I want him accountable because patients do better when nurses and doctors trust one another. Shame breaks that bond." He broke it. No one spoke for a long breath. Then the committee chair thanked her and asked if she needed a glass of water. She shook her head and returned to her seat. On the screen, Davenport's image didn't move, but his eyes were bright with something like pride. 2 weeks later, the hospital announced its decision in careful language. Dr. Richard Holloway's clinical privileges were revoked. He would not practice at St. Matthew's again. The report would be forwarded to the state medical board for review. Holloway vanished from the corridors like a storm finally passed. Yet a residue remained, a wariness, a study of skies for sudden thunder. It took time for people to believe that the change would hold. Time and small proof. A few months on, the hospital's foundation held a modest evening reception in the atrium. No chandeliers or violin quartets, just coffee urns, a tray of pastries, and a microphone on a slim stand. The director stood briefly to thank donors and staff. Then he invited Amara to the mic. She wasn't a public speaker, but the atrium was filled with faces she knew. Aides, nurses, residents, transporters, environmental services, physicians. She spoke about the code in 417, about the new huddles, about the tiny ritual of the speak up drill, making it easier to interrupt when something truly dangerous was about to happen. "I've learned that respect is not an idea," she said. "It's a practice. It's a thing you do again and again until it becomes the air we breathe." When she stepped back, the applause surprised her. It wasn't thunderous, this was a hospital after all, but it was warm, sustained, real. She caught sight of Davenport near the back, cane in hand, a small smile on his face. Next to him stood a framed announcement on an easel. The Evelyn Davenport Nursing Leadership Fund. Established by Charles A. Davenport in honor of his late wife, to support continuing education and leadership development for nurses at St. Matthew's. After the applause faded, Davenport made his way to her. "My wife was a nurse," he said. "I never told you." She had a way of making surgeons stand up straight without raising her voice. If she were here, she'd have pulled you into a hug so tight you'd have gasped. Amara laughed, then felt tears threaten. "Thank you," she said. "For the fund. For everything." "Thank me by using it," he said. "I've arranged for a handful of full scholarships for nurses to pursue advanced degrees or leadership training. I had you in mind when I signed the papers." He touched the edge of the easel, almost tenderly. "Do more than survive, Nurse Johnson. Lead." The word lingered in her mind for days. It felt too big, too presumptuous. She'd always imagined leadership as someone else's posture, someone else's volume. But when the chief nursing officer stopped by the step-down unit and asked whether she'd consider a part-time clinical educator role, teaching de-escalation, leading mock codes, helping new nurses find their voice, Amara didn't feel like an imposter. She felt ready. The first time she led an orientation class, she wrote 3 words on the whiteboard: assess, advocate, anchor. Assess the patient, the room, the team, the dynamics, she told the dozen nervous faces. Advocate for what the patient needs, and for yourself when you've been asked to do the impossible without help. An anchor. Be the voice in the storm. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You just have to be steady. She told them about room 412 without naming names. She told them what it felt like to feel small, to be made small, and what it felt like to stand anyway. When the class ended, one of the new nurses, a young woman with worry in her eyes, lingered. "Do you ever get scared?" the nurse asked. "To speak up." "All the time," Amara said. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It's deciding the patient's safety matters more than your comfort." "That sounds hard." "It is," Amara said and smiled. "That's why we practice." Autumn turned to winter and then to a spring that finally felt honest, a season with daylight long enough to believe in. Davenport came for his follow-up checkups, and when he was on her unit, he always asked for Amara, not as a demand but as a preference, like asking for a favorite chair at a beloved cafe. He never pulled rank. He asked about her mother's knees, he remembered everything, and whether she had started the educator role. He never told her what to do, but somehow when he left, she found herself doing the thing she had been doubting. One rainy Saturday, the elevator doors opened and Amara nearly collided with a woman carrying a bouquet of carnations. "Sorry," the woman said, breathless. "I'm late." "For who?" Amara asked, catching the flowers before they tipped. "For you." The woman smiled sheepishly. "My father was the code in 417. He's back home now. He said if I ever ran into a Nurse Johnson, I should tell her thank you for the second chance to be annoyed by his dad jokes." She handed over the carnations. "And that you were the first person in a long time who made the hospital feel like a safe place." Amara stood in the corridor a moment after the woman left, flowers in her hand, the elevator doors closing and opening with soft sighs. Safe place. For all the policy changes and the meetings and the hearings, it was this, a daughter's thanks, that lodged in her chest like a warm coal. She put the carnations in a plastic cup and set them at the nurse's station, where anyone could see them, smell them, claim them. "From a grateful family," she wrote on a sticky note and stuck it to the cup. For the rest of the shift, whenever a nurse walked by and smiled, she felt a small, steady joy. Months later, the state medical board issued its ruling on Holloway. The language made the rounds in emails and whispered conversations. Probation, mandatory remediation, cultural competency training, an external monitor for any future practice. He would not be returning to St. Matthew's, and whatever medical home he found would not be the kingdom he'd taken for granted. The news didn't spark celebration, it registered instead as a boundary. A line that was supposed to exist had finally been drawn. One evening, Amara took the long way out of the hospital, past the atrium and the donor wall where names were etched into glass. She found Davenport sitting on a bench near a planter of ferns, his cane resting across his knees. The building's hum wrapped around them, the quiet exhalation of HVAC, the roll of a cart, the distant beep of a monitor. "How is the educator role?" he asked without preamble. "Right," she said. "Feels right." "Good," he said as if she had filed a crucial piece of evidence. He looked at the donor wall, at the reflection of their two figures in the glass. "Do you know what I remember most from that day?" he asked after a moment. "In room 412, she said. "Yes." "It wasn't the insult." "Not really." He shook his head, the silver of his hair catching the lights. "It was the way you never stopped looking at the monitor. You were listening to him, but you were watching your patient. You never forgot who the room was for." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The quiet felt complete, not empty. "Justice is loud sometimes," he said. "Courtrooms, gavel strikes, news cameras. But most of the time it's quiet. It's someone doing the right thing when no one claps. Feels more like work than justice," she said, smiling. "Work is where justice lives," he said. "Which is why it's so easy to miss." A transport aide rolled past with a patient in a wheelchair and lifted a hand. Amara waved back. She thought of all the days that had brought her here, the ones spiked with humiliation and the ones buoyed by gratitude. She thought of the dozens of names on the donor wall, the hundreds of names on staff badges, the thousands of names on charts. She thought of the words, "you people," and how they had once felt like a blade. Now they were a memory that taught her where the soft parts were and how to protect them, hers and others. She stood. "I have an early shift tomorrow. Thank you for the bench." "Thank you for the hospital," he said, and it didn't sound like flattery. Outside, the sky had given up rain for a damp clarity. Streetlights reflected in puddles like coins tossed into a dark fountain. Amara walked to the subway with her bags slung over one shoulder, her steps unhurried. At the crosswalk, a teenager in a volunteer shirt darted past her to press the button, then stepped back and let her go first. She nodded in thanks and crossed. In the weeks that followed, the rhythms of St. Matthew's continued. Patients arrived in the early gray, frightened and hopeful. Families slept in chairs. Nurses whispered encouragement into ears that seemed beyond hearing. Doctors dictated notes in hallways, residents learned the delicate art of listening more than they spoke, and once in a while, more often now, someone interrupted someone else with a respectful question that prevented a small mistake from becoming a large one. And in a certain room on a certain afternoon, a nurse adjusted a cuff and glanced at a monitor, steady hands doing steady work. A physician walked in and asked for a status, and she gave it, clear and precise. The physician nodded, asked a question, listened to the answer, and said, "Good catch." No one clapped. No one needed to. The room felt as it should, intact. On her way home one evening, Amara stopped at a small bookstore and found a slim volume of essays by a nurse who had worked in a war zone. On the title page was a line she underlined 3 times. "We are not here to be right, We are here to be useful. She closed the book and smiled. Useful, yes. And seen. That night she called her mother, who asked as always, "How was your day?" "Busy," she said. "Good." "Hard." She hesitated. "Do you remember when I told you I might quit?" "I remember," her mother said gently. "I also remember you didn't." "I'm glad I didn't," Amara said. "Things are different." Her mother hummed, that satisfied sound mothers make when life nods in their direction. Different is good. Different is earned. Before bed, Amara stood at her apartment window and watched the city rinse itself in the glitter of traffic lights. Somewhere downtown, a judge was closing a case file. Somewhere in a quiet neighborhood, a retired one was putting away his cane and settling into a chair with a book, his heart steady. She pictured him nodding approvingly at a sentence as he so often did, and felt an answering nod in her chest. The fluorescent lights of St. Matthew's would hum again tomorrow. She would adjust a cuff and check a line and be the voice in the storm when the storm rose. The work would not be perfect. The world would not become fair because one man was held to account. But she had learned something she would carry like an amulet, that true power doesn't always announce itself, and dignity, quiet, persistent, practiced, outlasts arrogance. She turned off the lamp, the room soft with night. On the counter, a small vase held the last of the carnations, edges faintly browned, color still insisting. She breathed in the faint sweetness, set her alarm and climbed into bed, the city's pulse low and constant, as steady as a heart that has decided against all odds to keep on beating.